The following program is a Town of Colonie television production of the William K. Sanford Town Library.
So Dr. Sandler is a psychiatrist at Albany Medical Center. He teaches medical students and psychiatrists and psychologists in training. He wrote a textbook called Remembering with Emotion in Dynamic Psychotherapy. And he's going to tell you why he did not go the textbook route with this book, Tea with Freud, an imaginary conversation about how psychotherapy really works. It's not in the textbook how it really works? Or
It is, but it's a tougher read.
So here's Dr. Sandler to talk about his book, and later on he's got some for sale if you want to buy them or whatever. So,
Thank you very much, Joe. And thank you all for coming out in the weather. You dug your cars out. I was out there at 6 in the morning trying to get our cars out. It was a monster job. So I want to talk about this book called Tea with Freud. And first, however, I have to dispense with the two great myths of in the field of mental health today. Myth number one is that everything is genes and biochemistry. So somebody comes in with depression and they want a pill from me because they say, I know it's a chemical imbalance, my mother had it, I have it, and it's a genetic problem. I say it's a myth because I've never seen a single piece of research saying that depression is purely a genetic problem. Not a single study says that. And the same is true of anxiety, and the same is true of substance abuse, the three big things that we see in mental health. These are not just purely genetic diseases. I'll explain why. There is something genetic going on, but it's not the whole story. If you have a purely genetic disease like cystic fibrosis, a lung disease, if you have an identical twin who shares 100% of your genes, and if that twin has cystic fibrosis, you have cystic fibrosis. You don't even need to be tested. Nobody has to study this phenomenon. If you have those genes, you have cystic fibrosis. It's a done deal. This is not true for depression or anxiety or substance abuse. With depression, they've done a lot of twin studies, and so they find identical twins. And they have studies where they've done hundreds or several thousand twin pairs. And they take a look who's got depression. They find a twin with depression. And then they say, does the other twin also have depression? Which would be like cystic fibrosis. If it were cystic fibrosis, the other twin would have depression 100% of the time, right? It's not 100%. It's actually less than 50% of the time that the other twin is going to have depression. Even if you study older twins, thinking that, well, he doesn't have it yet, but he's going to get it. No, if you have older twins, it's the same thing. It's maybe 50 or less than 50% of the time that both twins have depression. So what's the other piece of the puzzle? Well, it's your life. It's what happens to you. If you have a twin who's depressed and you're not depressed, maybe something happened to your twin that did not happen to you. Maybe your twin went through a terrible divorce and a bitter custody fight. Maybe your twin had a terrible auto accident. Maybe your twin had something bad happen in childhood that didn't happen to you. So it's not just genetic diseases, it's a lot about our lives. In fact, what happens to you in life is a much bigger factor than your genes. And if it's about your life, maybe it would help to talk about your life with somebody like a psychotherapist, which is why I wrote the book, which leads us to the second big myth. The second myth says if we're going to talk about these things in this process called psychotherapy, then for goodness sake, let's not do Freudian psychotherapy, because Freud is old and dead and obsolete, and he was kind of a nutcase anyways. This is what a lot of people believe, and it's what a lot of people in my field believe. I've had to talk to psychologists and psychiatrists and say, listen, there's a lot of research coming up that using Freud in a more modern way, a more modern spin, gets great results. He has some wonderful ideas. I understand why people dismiss Freud. He said some things that don't make any sense in the 21st century. I don't know how it made sense in the late 19th century, he said that there is this Oedipus complex, right? That a little boy falls in love with his mother and wants to murder his father, and that there's a lot of men walking around with an unresolved Oedipus complex. I have yet to see a man come to my office for that kind of problem. It is true that little children have a little attachment often to the parent of the opposite sex. My youngest, who would kill me if she heard me say this, when she was about 4 or 5, planted a big kiss on my lips and said, "Daddy, I love you. I'm going to marry you when I grow up." It's so sweet, so sweet. And I said, "What are we going to do with Mommy?" And she said something about a bus ticket to Kansas or something. What are you going to get her? But it wasn't to murder her. It's just like, that's not part of the story, Dad. It's just you and me. So children do have these little fantasies. But is that the root of the so-called neuroses that Freud was treating? No. He said a lot of things that just seem silly now in the 21st century. But he also said some amazing things, like that we have defense mechanisms to block painful thoughts and feelings. He said that people walk into the office and look at me and start to transfer onto me feelings they had about other people in the past. So somebody comes in and say, I'm away for a week on a vacation, and a patient comes in and said, gosh, it was a little weird that you weren't here last week. And when we explore it, the patient says, well, it did cross my mind, maybe you just didn't want to see me. So, I was just taking a vacation. I wasn't trying to reject this patient. I just wanted to go to Florida for a few days. But she expects rejection from me and then tells me a terrible story about a bipolar father who was very rejecting towards her. So it's transference, Freud said. The patient is transferred onto me feelings she had about her father and expectations of her father. It's one of many brilliant ideas he had. The problem is we got stuck with his couch. So in the first half of the 20th century, everybody was doing psychoanalysis, and the patient would lie on the couch and free associate and say whatever comes to mind. Until in the second half of the 20th century, people said, we've been doing this for years and we're not sure it's getting any place. So they called the moving man and they threw out the couch and they put 2 chairs facing each other, and the analyst became more active, not just sitting and listening like in the New Yorker cartoons. Asking questions, redirecting, challenging people a little bit, and then things began to move. And then since the last 20 years or so, there's been some really good research saying if we sift through Freud's work and we separate the wheat from the chaff, we can have some really terrific outcomes. Now it's being documented in research. And that's why I wrote this book. So as Joe said, I wrote a book. It came out in 2011 for therapists. I said, this is how I do therapy, this is how I understand Freud, and this is some more modern stuff I've thrown in. But that was just a limited book for therapists. And then I said to my wife one day, wouldn't it be great if I could write a book explaining all this to the general reader? And my wife, who's very plain spoken, said, who do you think is going to read that? Implying it might be a little dry and boring. And I said, well, that's true, but if I could come up with some way to make it interesting, maybe a little entertaining, maybe somebody would actually buy a copy and read it. So I had this crazy notion that I'd have a dialogue with Freud, that somehow I would time travel back to early 20th century and be in his office in Vienna, and I'd have a conversation with him. And I explained to him how we do therapy, and he'd explain, no, you should do it my way, the old way. And I'd say, no. And so that's what I did. I wrote a chapter and gave it to a friend of mine who's a psychiatrist and a writer. And he was very kind and encouraging, so I continued. And then I wrote some chapters with actual patients with names and identities disguised, just verbatim what happens in my office. And I'll show you a little clip of what happens in my office soon. And so that's how I wrote Tea with Freud. And it proved to be a lot of fun writing, and I didn't have to put all those references that I did in the first book. You write 3 sentences, and then you got to put something, reference an article to prove that you actually know what you're talking about. Here I could be a little more creative and just have some fun, and I did. Part of the fun was I I wanted to describe his office, so I took a trip to Vienna. His original office is still there, and it's a museum, the Freud Museum. If you ever go to Vienna, you have to see it. And I had to stand in the rooms and get the feel for how big the rooms were, and his consulting room and his study, and where the light came in which window. And I also wanted to see the couch, which is not in Vienna, because in 1938, Freud, in the nick of time, got out. A friend helped him get out and escape the Nazis, and he had his stuff shipped to London, where he went. So the couch is in the Freud Museum in London. The couch and his desk where he sat writing these wonderful books. So I went to London as well, and I had goosebumps looking at the original Freudian couch. So that was a lot of fun doing that. And that's how I wrote the book. So I want to show you a little clip, and then we can open up for questions about how this psychotherapy works. And the model that I have liked the best over the past 20 plus years is a model that really tries to help the patient not just tell the story of what happened to her, but also get in touch with all the buried feelings. This was actually Freud's first approach, and then later on he became much more cerebral, and it was just analyzing. But therapy seems to work best if the patient can experience some of the affect, as we say, some of the emotion that got blocked. So I took a case from the book. It's chapter 2, and I named the patient Carla. It was from a real patient, and I changed names and all kinds of identifying information. And I hired an actress, and I told her, here's what I want you to do, and I wrote a little kind of a loosely written script to mimic chapter 2 in the book. Turns out the actress was awesome, amazing. We should see her someday getting an Academy Award. And I'll show you what happened here. She called me. She was 30 or 31 years old, she said, and she had a lot of anxiety. And also she said she was awfully mean to her boyfriend. And those are two things she wanted to work on in therapy. So hi, so you're Carla. So we spoke on the phone for a minute or two just to set up the appointment, and you mentioned a couple of complaints, but now that we're here, tell me what the problem is. The mirror on the wall is I copied it from another therapist, so when I teach psychotherapy at Albany Med or when I teach it at other sites, the trainees like to see what I'm doing as well as what the patient's doing. They want to know if I'm sitting like stony-faced like Freud supposedly sat, which I don't think was ever true, or if I'm actually having a facial expression or moving my hands or what I'm
doing. I guess I just feel anxious a lot.
Anxious?
Yeah.
Nervous?
Yeah. Like half the day.
Half the day, that's quite a bit.
I'm an on-the-go kind of person. I'm a go,
Mm-hmm.
never sit still.
Right.
So it's just hard. It's also hard to feel like I'm ever relaxing.
No, can't relax. Yeah. Is this a recent thing, or it's been like this always?
No, it's been like that a long time.
A long time.
Yeah.
Just a little nervous and can't relax.
Yeah.
Half the day. A little nervous now? Notice you're moving your hands a little bit, fidgeting a little bit.
I guess a little.
A little bit. Yeah. It seems to me you also mentioned on the phone another problem with anger, right?
Yeah.
What's that about?
I don't know. I feel like I'm really, really mean.
You are?
Yeah. To my boyfriend.
What's his name?
I'd say Jimmy.
Jimmy, fiance.
Yeah.
You're mean to him.
Yeah. And he doesn't really deserve it. But for some reason, I can't help myself. I just say really mean things to him, and
Can you give me an example?
I mean, call him a loser. I told him he's a loser because he doesn't make enough money.
Really?
And he really just doesn't, it's just not fair. He doesn't deserve that.
Yeah. You call him a loser?
Yeah. I do.
What else do you say?
I tell him I'm going to punch him in the face.
Seemed like a nice lady until this happened. Punch him in his face. No, she's laughing. And so we could say this is a nervous laugh. We could say it's a defensive laugh, a bit of a defense mechanism. Clearly there's nothing funny going on. But she's laughing and I'm taking note of this, and at some point I'm going to try and address this with her. So these are her two complaints. She's nervous all the time, and then turns out she says really nasty things and threats to her boyfriend, who is not threatening her in any way. It's not self-defense.
Are you sitting right across from her?
Yeah,
Oh, okay.
yeah. Really? You threaten to punch him?
I do.
Do you punch him?
No. I would never actually punch him in the face. It's just, he gets me frustrated. He knows how to push my buttons, and
You notice you're laughing as you talk about this. The laugh doesn't exactly match the topic.
no, it doesn't.
Punch him in the face, but
Yeah.
there's a laugh and there's a little fidgeting. I wonder if there's a nervous laugh there, perhaps.
It could be.
Could be.
Yeah.
And I wonder if the laugh covers up something about the anger.
It could.
It could. I was happy that she said that. She's willing to consider that, because I have had patients where I say, gee, I wonder if the laugh covers up the anger, and I get a pie in the face. What do you mean? I can't even laugh? What are you, picking on me, attacking me? You shrinks have to analyze everything. Some people are very bristly and not open to really looking inside. And she was very pleasant and cooperative right from the start. So yeah, her laugh could hide something.
Yeah, it's just, he's just like, ooh.
Her hands come up in anger,
Yeah.
but your face smiles and laughs as if to laugh it away. You come in with a problem of anger. It sounds like you really have a problem lashing out in anger verbally at Jimmy. But then it also, I get the impression that you may be covering something about the anger. Tense up and then laugh it off. And, there's a problem with anger there.
I don't know, because he really doesn't deserve it.
He doesn't deserve it. Well, I wonder where it comes from then. Did you grow up with anger? Did you grow up in an angry environment?
Yeah, my parents fought a lot.
You did?
Yeah.
That's a Freudian question, of course. Did you grow up with this, looking for childhood roots of the problem? In Freud's first paper ever, he was a neuropathologist. He was dissecting animal brains, and then he decided to get into this to make a living. But in his first paper ever with a colleague, he wrote, a lot of the problems adults have started in childhood. I don't think people on the streets in 1895 in Vienna were thinking that way until he said it. And so there's other kinds of therapy like cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, where you wouldn't ask about the childhood. You just say, well, you're nervous. What makes you nervous these days? And let's rearrange your thinking so it doesn't make you nervous. There's plenty of research for that kind of approach too. But the approach I like is if there's childhood root to it, let's get to it and let's straighten it out. We're still going to fix the present, but by also working in the past. Where did this come from? And she's got quite a story. I mean verbally? Like
Verbally, physically.
Oh, physically too?
Yeah.
You say that in a kind of a nonchalant manner. What do you mean they fought physically?
Oh, my mom would hit him.
Really?
Yeah. Wait. Not always. I mean, they got along sometimes, but when he drank a lot, she'd hit him, and they'd yell.
But so she would hit him.
Yeah.
And did he hit her back?
Oh, yeah. He would throw chairs and...
Throw chairs?
Yeah.
Sounds pretty violent.
Yeah, it was pretty rough.
Yeah, I noticed just a little laugh, a little, I don't know if you're almost biting the
corner of your lip or something. Yeah. Oh. So, a lot of domestic violence in the home.
Yeah.
So what was that like for you?
Gosh, it was so long ago. It's like it didn't even happen.
It didn't happen. She just told us it happened, right? But part of her brain says it was so long ago it seems like it didn't really happen. So she's using a little denial. Freud came up with this idea out of the blue. I'm waiting for the muses to hit me with such a brilliant idea, that there's defense mechanisms, that if a memory is too painful to bear, we just didn't happen, or other kids on the block had it worse, or some way to cope with it. Defense mechanisms can also be called just coping mechanisms. They're fine, we all need them, so we're not just spilling out unfiltered emotion all day long. We need to cope with painful things. But I look for them in the office to see if they're covering up something that we need to get at. So it's like it never happened, she says.
So how do you feel right now talking about it?
It's fine.
No feeling. It's a pretty dramatic.
The defense of isolating the affect. You can tell the story, you know what happened, but you block off the emotion. Another defense.
Story, huh?
I guess, I mean, it was hard.
Do you have brothers and sisters?
I did, yeah, I do. Younger brother and younger sister.
Uh-huh.
I would worry about Anthony a lot back then.
You worry about Anthony?
My little brother.
Yeah. Why is that? Why so worried?
My mom would hit him. Never us girls, but she would hit him.
You mean with her hand?
Sometimes.
Sometimes.
Yeah. Sometimes she would use an electrical cord.
She would hit Anthony with an electrical cord.
Yeah, she would.
That's terrible.
Yeah.
You saw it.
Pause and see what you're thinking as you watch this story unfold. We now have alcoholism, domestic violence. I'm just wondering what you're all thinking. Alcoholism, domestic violence, now terrible child abuse of her brother. What are you thinking looking at her? Any thoughts?
Like a walking time bomb.
Like a walking time. She is. Her boyfriend's lucky he's just getting verbal abuse right now. Yeah. And is it any wonder she's anxious? To grow up in a house like that, you would have to be an anxious child. So when people say, well, anxiety, it's just a genetic disease, I say, no. She has 100 reasons to be anxious from childhood on, and nothing has fixed any of this in her head. You know.
Is your response to her, what we're watching now, is that a pretty good example of how you react to your
I think I'm doing a great job of acting the part of me.
Because you seem like horrified that she went through, that she witnessed child
Oh.
abuse, and it's okay to show your patient that you're horrified?
Great question, Dr. Fruderman. Yes. In the old days, I was originally taught a sort of an analytic neutrality where you just sit there and the patient says, my brother was hit with an electric cord, and you say, what else? Or, my parents fought and they hit each other. I say, not to show a lot, as if to show my emotion is getting in the way of her story. But at some point, I realized that people who come from this background think this is normal. This is normal. They don't think it's shocking. I mean, she made a little face talking about her brother being hit. But I want them to know I'm having a reaction. I actually soup it up a little sometimes with some people and really dramatize it, although mostly it's just an honest reaction, like, what? That happened to you? Because it may be the first time she's had that reaction, because nobody in her house stopped all this chaos and said, I'm sorry, honey, this should never happen in your childhood. It was just normal. So yeah, I purposely show this. And a lot of times people will act like they don't even notice I'm doing that, and I'll stop them and say, you must have seen my reaction. How did that feel to you? And the patient says, well, it's weird. Like I don't want you to feel sorry for me or anything. And I'll say, well, maybe it's time somebody felt something for you. Yes, sir.
How would Freud critique your style? It's nice, it's comforting, it's current. What would Freud say about your work?
He'd probably tell me to shut my mouth. You can see in the book, though, I read a lot of Freud, of course, reread, and I read a lot about Freud, and we argue in the book about what I'm doing. I think he would say, I'm talking too much and I need to let the patient just free associate. And I say, no, I did that in training. I let the patient free associate. It was a wild goose chase. They would just talk on and on and on and jump from topic to topic, and we didn't get anywhere. Yeah, that's my answer to Freud. We had quite a row in the book. It was fun, actually. In some place in the book, I mentioned my dad, who was at the time 98 and still with us. And I deleted it. I said, I don't want this to be autobiographical. And then another thought came into my dad about my dad, and I wrote it down, and I deleted it. And finally, I said, you know what? He's 98 and he's dying, finally. We thought he was immortal. And Freud and my dad became mixed up in my head because Freud could be quite critical. And my dad could be quite an SOB sometimes, although I loved him dearly. So he got in there too. So the argument was, it was a little therapeutic writing the book. I got to win the argument with my father. Finally. Self-analysis.
Yeah.
What do you worry about it?
Yeah. I worry about him still now. I mean, if I try and get him on the phone and he doesn't answer, I fear like he had a car accident or.
Oh, you're still worried about Anthony?
Yeah.
After all these years?
Yeah.
Sounds very tough.
Yeah.
Well, as we talk about it again, I noticed that you, sometimes you're a little fidgety or you turn your mouth like you're going to bite your lip, but you don't seem to have any particular emotions about all of this. It's like it never happened.
It was just so, it was so long ago.
That sounds pretty awful.
It was, yeah, we were scared all the time.
Scared all the time. What was the worst of it? I mean, is there a specific memory you can share with me so I can really get a picture of it?
So I often ask for a specific memory. People can talk about a general problem for hours and hours without really getting in touch with any feeling about it. If you ask for a specific story, things heat up. And here's what happens in the first session.
I do remember one night in particular. My dad had been drinking a lot, and my mom they were fighting, and my mom was threatening to leave. She was going to leave and take us with her. And he was really drunk, and he put himself in front of the door, kind of barricading it, and wouldn't let her go. And he was saying some horrendous things about what he would do to her if she tried to leave.
He was threatening her?
Yeah. And at one point my mom said, okay, never mind. She went upstairs and kind of thought it was over. My dad went back in the kitchen to get more beer. And apparently my mom had actually called the police. The police showed up at the door a little while later, and she kind of quickly and quietly went to the door and let them in. And we followed her and the cops back to the kitchen where my dad was. And the cops were trying to talk to him. And he picked up a butcher knife.
He did?
And was kind of behaving threateningly towards the police. And I just remember watching them throw him down on the ground and handcuff him. And I mean, they pulled a gun on him and they had him at gunpoint.
Wow. What's it like to remember this? You got some feelings this coming up, huh?
Yeah, it's sad.
Yeah, sad indeed.
It's really sad.
Terrible story.
I guess I just think if I were a parent, I would never expose my kids to that.
No, of course not. All that stuff you were with your brother and sister saw is terrible for kids.
So she has a breakthrough of emotion. I want to say that there's a purpose to this, not just that I want to take over the Oprah show and have people be crying on my TV show. The first thing she says is, I would never treat my kids like that, which means that she's starting to have some compassion for herself and say, God, that was really sad. In fact, that was terrible, and I'd never put my own children through that. What she's starting to experience is some compassion for herself, which I would hope would make her a better person and more compassionate towards others. And by the way, the real patient did not have a boyfriend. The real patient had a husband, was married, and the real patient came in after a couple months of therapy and said, I have great news, I'm pregnant. And I went back and reviewed this tape, and I thought, how wonderful that her first comment after this first breakthrough of emotion is about she would never treat her kids like that. Because otherwise she would be a parent with a big blind spot. You know, nobody ever said, nobody ever tended to her emotional suffering and her fear. So if her kids went through something, she may not even see it, may not respond to it, may not protect them as parents ought to do. Your thoughts?
I'm curious to know, do you usually have a breakthrough like this in your first session, or does it take a while?
It can take a while. I use this particular case for part of my book because things do unfold so quickly. If you're going to do a case where you get this in session number 9, the reader will be exhausted before they get to it. And I've used her real tape to teach colleagues, because I can say, this might take you 10 sessions, but here's what it's going to look like ultimately.
So is it usual that it takes longer?
Oh, it varies a lot. It's not rare that you can get this in one session. And when I first saw a guy doing this, I said, wow, where can I get that? Where do I learn that? Because what I learned was this endless talking. Yeah. Which could get you some intellectual insights. The patient just say, oh, well, yeah, I guess I'm nervous now because I was nervous then, but nothing changed. Nothing changed. Let me show you the rest of the little clip. Oh, yeah.
When we're doing all this work, research and thinking, and thinking about, you mentioned your dad, did it seem to enhance your regular clinical work, or at times get in the way of it?
No, it didn't get in the way. I think, if anything, it made me more thoughtful. I'd be sitting there thinking, oh, yeah, this is the point I was trying to make in the book. This is exactly the point. Yeah. Yeah, I remember moments like that.
Yeah, I mean, we would hide upstairs in our room, my brother, my sister, and I. We would box our ears so we couldn't hear them hitting each other at the chairs and stuff. And
It's scary for kids.
yeah. She was angry. She was really angry.
Your mom?
Yeah. And she just, she'd throw beer bottles at him.
Really?
She would sort of hold it all in and bottle it all up, and then throw beer bottles at him. And I kind of feel like that's what I do with Jimmy. I just don't throw bottles.
What do you do with Jimmy?
I say terrible things.
So you bottle it up just like your mother, and you lash out just as she did, but you do it with words.
This is a wonderful interpretation. I wish I had thought of it, but she beat me to the punch. She's never realized why she's so mean to him, but she's just identifying with her mother. Her mother was doing this to Dad, and she says, I'm doing the same thing. I don't throw beer bottles, I just throw mean words out. It was a great connection she made. And again, the connection comes after this breakthrough of affect, of emotion. Yes, ma'am?
Is this a real person?
This is an actress.
Oh, she's playing the part of
Yes. Yeah. I told her, maybe you came in a little, yeah, sorry. She's an actress, but this is a real case, and it's chapter 2 in the book. And I wrote out a little script for her. We talked about what I wanted to happen, and she did it.
Do you think that changed?
That
She's an actress?
Yeah,
Well,
the
it's-
fact that she's reenacting.
Yeah, it's not the
what you told
same,
her.
it's not exactly the same as the real patient, but she did a terrific job, and she really captured what the patient went through.
Yeah, she does. It's
Yeah.
hard to tell.
Yeah, right. If I didn't tell people it was an actress, I don't think people would catch
No,
up.
no.
You know, she's very, very talented.
In your real sessions, did you ever see a pattern of what triggered Jimmy's behavior? What triggered her anger? Was there a pattern there of things, one thing maybe that he did, or a couple things that triggered her to
Well,
be angry?
it turns
Turns out Jimmy was not a perfect human being,
Yeah.
as none of us are. She had had a car wreck. She wasn't hurt, but she was nervous afterwards in a car. And sometimes he would drive fast, and she'd say, "Cut it out." And he says, "Oh, chill out." And she said, "He's a great guy, but sometimes he's a little immature." So I think anything that made her feel threatened made her really angry, because she lived with such threats. And then she would threaten him. Yeah. Yeah. Let's finish the little clip.
Quite a connection to make. You ever think about that before? You ever realize that before? In some way that you're copying your mother's behavior?
I haven't, no. I don't really talk about this stuff, so.
Yeah. You don't really talk about this stuff. So what's it like to talk about it with me today?
It's hard.
Yeah, I'll bet it is.
I've just never done therapy. It just feels like opening up a lot of stuff.
It's all been packed away in there, huh? All boxed up.
All boxed up. Yeah.
As we look at it, it seems like you begin to have some sadness and some compassion for what you and your brother and sister went through.
Yeah, I mean, it's sad. It was awful.
Yeah.
It was awful.
Maybe better to feel the sadness rather than tell yourself, well, it feels like it never happened and it's a long time ago. And maybe better to let some of this out and feel some compassion for yourself and Anthony, your sister. Maybe change the way you treat Jenny.
Maybe.
And let some of these feelings out, put them where they belong, instead of staying all tense and anxious and periodically lash out with the anger at him without knowing where the anger comes from.
I don't want to do that.
Yeah, I wouldn't think so. I hope not.
What happened was, after maybe 6 or 8 visits, something shifted with her fiance, as we call him here, her boyfriend. She got into talking about all this stuff. She had a lot of anger at her parents and a lot of anger at her father, who left the family and left them penniless and never paid any child support. They didn't have food in the house sometimes. It was really the other trauma to her life was poverty. She was growing up with her siblings and her mother in abject poverty. So she was venting all this anger at her father, and then she goes home and Jimmy comes home with an expensive pint of ice cream, and she says, "What the hell are you buying that ice cream for? You don't make enough money, you're a loser." And then she stops mid-sentence and says to him, "I'm sorry, this is not about you. This is about my father. I'm angry at him, and I'm working it out with my shrink, and I'm sorry I talked to you like that." I'm sure he dropped the expensive ice cream on the floor, or at least dropped his jaw. And from then on, she said it stopped. She did not mistreat Jimmy anymore, because she was just displacing the anger about Dad onto him. Once she connected it with Dad and began to work it through, then why beat up on Jimmy? That changed. The anxiety started to come down. And then after about 16 visits, She calls me and says, I have to cancel today. My OBGYN says my blood pressure is up and down and I need to go on bed rest for a while. I'll call you. And I said, fine. So a number of months later, a total of 9 months from when she discovered she was pregnant, she calls me and says, I have a beautiful baby boy and just want to let you know things are good. And I said, great, you want to come back and make an appointment? And she said, I don't really think I need to. I'm not anxious. I'm not pounding on Jimmy. Life is pretty good. So that was it. We ended after 16 visits. You never know, of course, what's going to happen. And sometimes people disappear, and I wonder, like, did that hold up? Did the results hold up? So 2 years later, the phone rings. It's her, Carla. And she says, I got to see you right away. I'm terribly anxious. I thought, oh, damn, I thought we fixed this. But she came in and she said she had been fine for 2 years, just fine. Now she's got a 2-year-old child. Fine until a sister called her, inebriated, and said, today's the day I'm going to kill myself. You know, the other kids in the family didn't get out unscathed either. She says, no, 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 wait, I'll come over. And she goes rushing over to the house, takes the bottle away, takes the bottle of pills away, and puts her sister to bed. 2 days later, the phone rings. It's me. Today's the day I'm going to kill myself. She goes running over. We did a couple sessions. She was so worried about her sister until the family closed ranks, got the sister into inpatient rehab, and then the patient came in and said, I'm fine. It was really just triggered by that immediate family crisis. So she did very well in a really short therapy. I mean, 16 visits to deal with that is short. You know, I use cases like this because it's easier to teach and it gives me bragging rights. The full story is this could take 2 or 3 years with somebody else. To which I say, fine, if I can solve the problem, and it takes a couple of years, better than not solving it. But sometimes it's rather quick. And that's the story about therapy. Questions, comments, thoughts about it?
Very interesting.
Thank you. Thank you. Joe?
Sometimes you have many sessions and then you just don't hear from people anymore.
And then what?
You just don't hear from people anymore.
Well, sometimes people do very well and they leave, and I always say, let's do a 6-month follow-up, because I want to make sure that the results held up. But sometimes people leave town or they don't come for the 6-month follow-up. Yeah.
How does that make you feel? That would be frustrating.
It is. But as long as people get to a good point, then I say, fine, I figure if they need more help, they'll call me or call somebody. Yeah, but I really like to get the follow-up, and it makes me a better therapist. Because sometimes people come back and say, I'm a mess again, and then I get to say, okay, what did we not do? What did I miss? Or what are we not doing right in the whole profession? Is there something we can tweak and make it better?
When people try to discredit Freud's work by using some of the theories of childhood sexuality, how do you respond to them when they try to discredit his work?
I give them a longer version of what I gave you today. I say, yeah, he had a lot of ideas that just sound dopey and crazy, but look at the ideas he has that are good. I've been lecturing at colleges. I was just out at UMass Amherst last week, and I put up a slide with a dozen ideas that Freud came up with over a century ago that I still use in the office every day, like transfers. So I'm not going to argue and defend every idea he had. It would be silly. Nobody hits the bullseye every time. He was a very prolific thinker and prolific writer, and some of the things he said were just off base.
I think he was very courageous. Some of his ideas.
He was. Well, one writer said it very nicely. Said that his first patients, many of them were young women, talking about histories of child sexual abuse. That wasn't something that one generally talked about in Vienna, 1895. And this one psychiatrist said he takes a lot of flack for some sexist comments he made later on, but he was perhaps the first person to sit down and let these young women tell their stories in detail and listen and care and try and help them understand how this had affected them. That was a lot for those days.
I was a double major in English and psychology, and when the literature, to me, always developed psychology, because it's older than that.
Yeah.
I mean, as a profession, as a study. And Freud was, I mean, he may have had some crazy ideas, but that doesn't mean that they weren't true. Because when you read, he was very well read.
Oh, yes.
Very different from a lot of people today,
Yeah.
especially young people.
Yeah.
Terrible.
Yeah, don't get me started.
Okay. Me too. But everything that he talked about, when you read literature, I mean, that's how I saved a lot of money in the beginning by not going to a therapist, because of the literature that I studied.
Yeah.
And it's older than Freud.
Well, his granddaughter was interviewed, and she said many of his ideas have been around for thousands of years through thinkers
Exactly.
and poets and philosophers, and he put them down more systematically and expanded upon them, but they've been around. Yeah.
I don't think he's sexist. I don't think he's racist. I don't think he's any of that. I think this was a brilliant, like you said,
Yeah.
innovative approach to helping people.
He was a brilliant kid. He taught himself English so he could read Shakespeare, the original. Yeah.
So, anyway.
Yeah, he had quite a mind.
How has the current atmosphere of health insurance affected talk therapy and
Well, amazingly enough, they still pay psychiatrists to do it.
I did not know that.
They'll still pay my bill.
Can't
whether
hear
I'm doing-
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Yeah, the question was how has health insurance affected talk therapy? And I said, the first amazing thing is that they'll pay my bill at all. They would rather I do medication management,
Yeah.
right? Which is a shorter visit and cheaper, just do a bunch of medication management. But they will pay me to do psychotherapy. And they're paying psychologists and psychiatrists and social workers. They will put some limits on it sometimes, but it seems to me it's loosened up over the past 10 years or so. They were really driving me crazy with these silly treatment reports, and now they're not bugging me as much. So far, so good. And there's a ton of data that says psychotherapy can help, and there's a ton of data that says your emotional health affects your physical health. So maybe somebody's actually reading that stuff and wising up.
If a person is experiencing transference and is aware of it, is there anything short of psychotherapy that the person can do to reverse that?
If a person is experiencing transference, is there anything short of psychotherapy to reverse that? I don't really know the answer to that. I know what to do in the office. I'm not sure what to do out of the office. Well, that's a complicated question, how to deal with it.
Got a question for you.
Yeah.
How does one get somebody close to them, not a husband, he thinks it's all bunk, but how does one get a child that one sees needs psychotherapy, and I mean psychotherapy? How do you get them to do that? Or is that too much of a big question?
Well,
I
I
mean-
also am a child and adolescent psychiatrist. So
No, this one's 31.
Oh, an adult.
Yeah.
How do you get somebody to do therapy? Boy, I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know. The only answer I have, people call me and say, I can't get him to come, what should I do? And they're asking about somebody that I've never met.
Right.
The only answer is try and get somebody that he trusts to sit down with him and say, you
We'll
need to
put
give
them
it
in
a
the
shot.
car and drive them
Well,
there.
a little hard at 31, easier at 7. Yeah. You can take a horse to water, but
Right.
yeah, sometimes people just refuse.
Well, it's not refusal, it's other problems.
Yes,
What's the big difference between CBT and DBT?
CBT and DBT. Cognitive behavioral therapy is CBT, working with cognitions that are hanging you up, or false beliefs you have, I'm worthless, I'm no good, how to correct those beliefs. DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy, was really designed for a specific kind of person, the borderline personality disorder, which is somebody who has explosive rage and has a lot of trouble controlling emotions, and it's to help that person get control. It is a spin-off of CBT, but particularly for people who have trouble regulating their emotions. Well, I want to thank you all for coming out the day after the big snow. There's books for sale on the back table by Joe, and appreciate you coming out.
Thank you.
Thank you.